Today, we're coming up with a very interesting sort of a pace at which we are currently in the entire fintech space. We've seen in the last decade or so, since I started my career in the fintech space, we saw a lot of fintech players moving from what was previously a gray area in the entire financial regulated space to now becoming in or moving in tandem with the regulators. So, if I remember back in 2012, when I first started my career, there were a bunch of these fintech new age companies which were coming up who were at least 10 steps ahead of the regulators. And for regulators, it was always about playing a catch up game. But with COVID, a lot of that has changed. Nowadays, if you're a fintech builder and you are doing something that's in a gray area in the regulatory space, then you can definitely expect the regulators to come knocking on your door. In fact, it's not just fintechs. Even big entities today are not, safe from the regulator coming and knocking on their door if it turns out that they're not adhering to the laws that the regulators have laid down. Now, in such a situation, one thing that we often think about is if there's going to be so much of a regulatory box and the box keeps getting closer and closer, how will innovation happen? I think that's why I wanted to do this talk, because when we think about open finance or open banking, this entire initiative was actually something that was thought up by the regulators almost 30 years before. So this is definitely something that the regulators were ahead of that time back then. Of course, technology probably wasn't around to kind of support all of that. But yes, come cut to today, we're seeing open finance, open banking across the world pick up in a very, very great way. And so I thought today we'll talk a little bit about open finance, open banking, and the entire open data conversation as well. But before that, if you all are new here, then thank you so much for joining me today. I know tomorrow is a holiday in a lot of in large parts of the country. So the fact that all of you would spend your midweek vacation, the eve before your midweek vacation with me, really, really happy for that. But yes, so those of you who are new over here, I'm Kamalika Podar. I also go by the pseudonym of the FinTech Chronicler, and I started doing these weekly conversational style community podcasts recently, in addition to the newsletter that I also run. And the agenda is that while there's a lot happening in the fintech space, I think these open discussions that we have here is what really helps us also to understand the concepts a lot better and kind of segregate the noise from the actual meat of the problem. And today we're going to be talking about account aggregators. Now, the reason why I thought of doing this is because very recently I remember seeing this amazing article. By the way, all of you should also read it, about how account aggregators are helping in the entire digital collection journey. Now, if you remember, about 5-10 years back, digital lending was like the flavor of the fintech season. Almost everyone was trying to get into lending to the underserved or the unserved population over there. And they pretty soon realized the reason why most of these thin book credits or low credit score customers are not being served by typical institutions is because collections was a huge problem. But today, with data, with a lot of data being available, I think even collections there is helping play a very big role over there. But that got me thinking, if we see how fintech has been kind of evolving over the years, the focus still is around lending. Now I understand why it's around lending, because of course that's where the margins are. I mean, ask any banker. Abhishek is there with us in the audience, and he's been a seasoned banker. He'll tell you that yes, margins are the highest in lending if you can manage your risks properly. So I thought, why not take the entire account aggregator conversation, the entire open finance, open banking conversation, and think of use cases that we can have beyond that of just lending. The way that I thought I'll structure this entire thing is we'll first start off with a brief about what open finance, open banking is, how it evolved over time, India's implementation of open finance, which is also known as account aggregator. We'll talk of the growth of account aggregator in India. And for this, I also thought it would be a good thing for us to not just go through the technical aspects of account aggregator in India, but also UK's implementation of open banking, because a lot of what we're seeing in account aggregator today has, in a way, taken inspiration from what was implemented thanks to GDPR and stuff like that in the UK. And of course, finally, we'll also talk about some of the use cases that I can see having a potential down the road. Maybe not today, we may just be too early in the game for it today. But down the road, I do see a lot of potential for some of these other use cases that are there around financial inclusion for open finance to kind of take up. Also, I would love to encourage all of you at any point in time, if you feel that I'm either going too fast or you have a differing point of view, do raise your hand, come up on stage, and we'll have a very healthy debate and discussion out there. So, with that said, let's get started. Now, I am also trying to record this entire session. So, in case any of you feel like you're not able to give 100% here, then don't worry. I will definitely share the recording with all of you. All right. So, open finance as it stands today, it's actually, if I had to draw Venn diagrams out here today, then there's a small bubble which is open banking, where you're aggregating all bank related information like your account statements, your personalized banking service information, all other sorts of cash management and all of those other things that your banks typically do for you. Then you have open finance, where you have insurance, mortgage, pensions, consumer credit, investment related data, all of those coming in. So a lot of use cases that you see globally around open finance happen to be around personal financial management, one shot dashboard for your entire wealth management journey, doing using a lot of alternative data for doing an accurate consumer credit assessment, building sachet sized personalized insurance products, and so on and so forth. And then the biggest one of them all, one encompassing both of this, is open data. Now, with open data, you're bringing in other information pieces also into the conversation, like airlines, telecom, energy, retail, public transport, and all of those other things that we do on a day to day basis. So, here, some of the use cases that are coming up are on, by the way, Amazon had this very beautiful sort of a video that they did on Alexa, where they're having an entire voice enabled digital assistance that's managing your entire utility bill, all your subscription products, and everything seamlessly through the Alexa app itself. Then you also have personalized travel offers, financial and non-financial marketplaces, and curated offers for you on all of those. So yes, and this generates a lot of alternative data also that can be used for credit underwriting as well. So yes, even I couldn't kind of fully escape from the entire open finance for digital lending over there. But that's the genesis of how open finance, open data, etc. came up into play. So that's about the genesis behind open finance that's there. Um, Moving on to the next piece, which was all about understanding, how open finance, open data, and all of these are playing in with each other, or how they came into existence in the first place. So open banking, by the way, was something that was set up by UK under their PSD2 norms to give better control to consumers over their data in a way that they can consent to third parties, grant them aspect with respect to sharing their payments related data, or for even initiating payments over there. So this was all when GDPR came into being, back in mid 2010s out there. And because of this entire consent, or the user consent based data sharing process that was there, the European Union kind of realized that this can kind of extend to beyond just payment data as well. So one of the first instances that they decided to implement was to expose banks APIs. And now banks, of course, are not going to be very okay with sharing that kind of an information openly through a standardized set of API, right? So the way that UK went about doing it, and even Europe for that matter, copied the similar model over there. What they started off was on the bank front. Let me quickly just open up the open banking's banking data information that was there, because it's pretty interesting over there. So they started with, where is it for me? Yes, there. The first thing that they started off with was on ATM locators for bank branches, ATM and branch locators. Now, obviously, every bank would want their customers to be able to seamlessly know, or even their potential customers to seamlessly know where they are. Now, this is not any compete related. It's not a competitive product offering over there. But that was what they initially started off with, where these common APIs, you can expose all your ATM locations and branch locations into third party providers, app providers over there, or third party text providers that are there. And any app that you have, let's say that you are on Zomato booking a table, but you also realize that you don't have enough cash with you. Assume that we're in an era that's pre-COVID, and so UPI was not that big. So before you step into the hotel that you've booked, or the restaurant table that you've booked, you want to make sure that you pick up cash. So then you can use the API, the ATM locator that is inbuilt into Zomato's app itself, to on the way pick up cash and then check into the restaurant and then into your table and stuff like that. So that was a very interesting use case, where they started with a small case, not too technically heavy, where the whole agenda was to make sure that consumers are served better. Then after that came personal accounts, business accounts, commercial credit, and SME loans, and all of those other products as well. We'll get into each of those in a bit. But that was, I kind of liked the way that they went about, where you're not exposing any financial related information. Instead, what you're starting off is with a very small set of information pieces that can actually help consumers, even if they're not on your banking app. Now, it would have been very easy for a lot of bankers to say that, you know what, all of this information is already there on our bank. But what if your consumers, most of your consumers, may or may not have your banking app installed on their phone, but chances are that they do have one of these consumer facing apps present on their phones. So it was quite easy for the regulatory authorities at UK to push back and make banks see the value that's there in this, to eventually banks agreeing by themselves to share a vast variety of data types. Now, when we think of, I'll just take a brief pause here and kind of get slightly technical with all of you, because I do want to talk about the different types of information that you can get through open banking. And by the way, this is common not just for the open banking implementation in UK, but even in India. So one is the product metadata that we were talking about, right? Where you have ATM and branch locators, and if you have product related information like your savings account, your current account, the details that are there on it. For SME lending, the kind of right now we have something called a key fact statement. So all of those sort of metadata about your product can also go in through an open API over there. Then we also have transactional data available. You have your balance related data available. In the UK, not in India yet, you can also get customer profiles or KYC related data. And this is pretty important because I think some of the financial inclusion use cases that I was thinking about kind of hinges on this data type being readily available. You have account details available. You also can see what all standing instructions, direct debits, and all of those variable recurrent payments that you've set up on your account as well, and any other counterparty details also. Like for example, let's say through your bank you have also opted in for a life insurance or a term insurance. All of those information, also the premium that you pay every year to the to XYZ entity, all of those will also be available on the data side for for this is all for consumers. For business specific detail, you will also get to see your letter of credits that you have, if any, settlement related data that you've made to your vendors or from your buyers, and all of those good things. So the entire recon management that a lot of small businesses has to do can be easily done through these open APIs through open banking. Now, coming to the account types, with respect to what's implemented in India and in the US for banks alone, you have a current account, savings account. You have this is on the bank side. You also have in UK any e-wallets that you have, any prepaid instruments that you have, all of those information also. Loan accounts and credit cards also. In India, we're still kind of fighting to get that information onto the account aggregator system. Then on the money market side, any of your dematerialized accounts, the holdings that are there in that, all your investments accounts, your certificates of deposits, pension related data, all of those are the different account types that are present over here. In fact, what I will also do is, after this call, I will definitely share with all of you where you can see it's a public the Revit specs that are there, where you can see all the different data types and the timelines for when they're going to be made available if they're not currently live in India as well, because it's very important that we know what all data types do we have access to on today's date over there. All right, moving on. How has open finance been playing out in the world right now? But before that, I think I'd want to take a quick pause over here, just to see if anyone has any doubts, or if anyone has any questions that they would like to raise, then please do come up on stage. Would be happy to take that up. All right. In case you're facing trouble in coming up on stage, at the bottom right corner of your screen, you should be able to see a hand icon over there. So do hit that, and raising your hand will immediately bring you up on stage. All I'll have to do is just approve, and don't worry, unless and until my system crashes, I will make sure I approve all of you on stage. So the way that open finance world over has been growing, there are typically broadly three ways in which it's been growing. One is a completely regulatory or regulation driven open banking, where being a part of this open API standards is mandated by your regulators. Then we have something that's a hybrid sort of a place, where both the regulators as well as market forces come together to deliver upon open finance. And then finally you have the industry driven, where it's completely left to the industry, for the market forces themselves to come up with these different API standards. Now each of them have their own pros and cons, so I will kind of spend 5 minutes on that as well. When we think about regulation driven open finance that's there, Canada, by the way, ranks highest on that front, followed by South America. So Brazil's with Pix. By the way, Pix has been doing spectacularly well on that front over there. And a lot of the European Union as well is regulatory driven. So it's become mandatory for them in European Union for them to be a part of the open finance API structure that's there. I think, and I'm not sure, but I will need to confirm this, but I think Australia and New Zealand too are regulatory driven. When it comes to being completely industry driven, you will not believe it, but China happens to be completely industry driven. It's the market forces there that's kind of developing these open finance protocols that's there. Another place that is, and China was very surprising for me because all of the banks are technically like they state owned, right? They state driven over there. So for me, I felt that developing an API standard would have been much easier if it came from the People's Bank of China itself, and that way everyone else has one particular standard of APIs to adhere to, versus a market driven force where every fintech company that's coming up on the open finance side has to kind of develop their own API standards and then integrate with the banking stack of the various banks that are serving customers over there, which is a very tedious task. And that is also one of the challenges that US is currently facing, because again, they don't have any open banking, open finance regulations or any norms around that. So you have companies like Wise, you have companies like Plaid and all of them, Yodlee, who are sitting and developing their own API protocols. And there were, last I checked, I think there are about 3,000 banks in the US, each of them with a completely different tech stack. So for Yodlee to scale, it means that every time that they go to a bank, they need to understand the tech stack of that bank and then develop APIs that at their end that they can integrate with the bank's tech stack. And it's a huge challenge over there, which is why growth has been limited to just the top 20 odd banks in the US alone. Versus India, where we have our digital public infrastructure, and I will definitely be talking a lot more about the entire DPI approach that's there, where you have on one side the standards, the protocols are set by the government, but the use cases and the challenge of bringing on customers, bringing on utility for end consumers, all of that resides with the tech players that are there, or the market forces that are out there. So I think the entire DPI approach, it's now becoming an entire, and that's the prime reason why we saw BIS engaging with Nandan Nilekani to figure out a way that we can have this DPI approach for Finternet as well. So it does make sure that you have that interoperability between all the different standards that are there. Your speed to market is there because all the protocols and the API standards are already set by the central regulators over there. But on the other side, user adoption is also high, trust is also high, because market has to make sure that you're serving customers in a way that is, they feel trusted, they feel like they have the control at their end. In India, by the way, if any of you here using the IND Money app, or even Grow app for that matter, yeah, so a lot of you would have had to submit your bank statements, right? And that nowadays no longer happens via PDF upload on Grow or on Zerodha, even on Jar, I think. Yes, these are some of the big fintechs that I remember are live with account aggregator. So the flow that's there over there, it's a very simple sort of a flow where the user comes in, logs into the client app, or the, in India we call it the financial information user app, in which in this case it's an IND Money or a Jar or a Grow or a Zerodha or something like that. And when the FIU, the financial information user, asks for your bank statements, what you are instead directed to is an account aggregator widget over there. It could be an API of the account aggregator, but basically it's the account aggregator that's integrated onto the FIU. They ask to discover your accounts that's there with, say, an SBI or an HDFC or any other bank. Once the bank responds back telling them that yes, we found ABC account, we've discovered ABC account for this particular user, this is the information that we've passed to them. Typically for bank accounts, the primary key is your mobile number. If, say, the mobile number is also not working, then the latest implementation that's gone live, I think it was on Jan 10th of this year, was that you can also discover, or you can dedupe accounts with date of birth and PAN. I mean, it could be that I have a joint account, with someone else, but my where I am the primary holder, my PAN number will be on top over there, right? So that deduping becomes easier over there. So you have additional layers of using date of birth and PAN as well to dedupe and uniquely identify accounts. So now once the bank has sent back this particular discovered account, the next step is for the user to link it to this account aggregator platform. Now, when this linking happens is when the account aggregator can initiate the next step, which is ask the user for consent in order to transfer a parameter of information that the financial information user, IND Money, Jar, Grow, etc., are asking for. Now, this consent artifact, or this entire consent concept is pretty important, because here you are placing control on the user's customer's hand over here. And to verify this consent and to finally link your account over there, your bank needs to send an OTP. Now, there's a lot of confusion around this, because a lot of people, a lot of apps have in fact been auto reading and auto submitting OTP. This actually MeitY and RBI do not allow for this to happen, but we'll get into the entire regulation things at another point in time in the interest of time. But yes, you have to manually enter that OTP over there. You can do an auto read, but the submission has to be manual, which is why I think a lot of people don't even realize that they've raised or given a consent for a particular data type over there. Now, once the consent is ready, is when the entire data massaging starts happening at the financial or the bank's end or the financial information provider's end. And when that is ready, they send a notification to account aggregator that yes, this data is ready. We've encrypted it in the format requested, etc., etc. The account aggregator fetches that information, that encrypted data, and sends it to the financial information user, who then decrypts it at their end and then passes it for whatever further processing that's there. By the way, I was doing some time back in December when I was still a part of account aggregator ecosystem. Back then, I was doing an analysis and I found that about 90% of most of this data processing happens within 3 minutes. 90% in 3 minutes. That's an amazing turnaround time over there. I mean, if I had to manually upload my PDFs, I'm going to take more than 10 minutes over there. So I think that's one huge place where account aggregators played a big role in reducing the complexity in the system. But when it comes to the use cases that are there, now this is where I think I draw inspiration from what's happening on the open banking UK front over there. Because if you go into their GitHub page, you'll notice that a lot of their methods, a lot of their APIs also allow for writing. Now, account aggregator in India today only allows for reading financial information alone. Writing is still not available. Now, I'm not saying that anyone should be allowed to write or overwrite APIs or data on our financial information, on our financial platforms over there. But I think there are some entities that, especially when it comes to financial inclusion, can do a great job if they're given the right to write onto financial platforms, onto financial data. The one place that I can think of is the KRA services that we have in India. Now, KRA is basically the registrar for all our KYC related documents that's there. It's a regulated entity that's issued by, I think it's SEBI, but I'll have to confirm that again. But KRA stands for KYC Registrar Agent. Basically, anytime you upload any KYC document, either through your DigiLocker or even your Aadhaar and your PAN numbers, this data gets verified, validated at a KRA's end to the financial information user that's there. Now, along with, so basically, let's say that your PAN or your permanent address on your Aadhaar has changed. You've asked for a change over there. Typically, you will have to go through a huge process to change that. But once this change happens at the government, at UDAI's end, for example, in this case, then UDAI should have that agency to be able to write into the KRA system with the updated information. And then from there on, the KRA can trickle down to all the other financial information, financial platforms that are there that are using this particular user's permanent address on their KYC docs and give them a nudge that this particular address, permanent address has changed. Do you want to change it to? Now, the reason why I think this is a very interesting play over there is because in India, and this is not just for communication address or for permanent address changes, I think another area where this can have a very big role is on the beneficiary or the nominee details that we're typically asked to fill out. Now, let's be honest, how many of us have filled up the nominee details whenever we're opening a new account and stuff like that? I mean, the last time I filled it up was when I was making a very big investment. So that's exactly why I filled it. But typically, nominees do not tend to change very rapidly over time. You'd probably have one other nominee that you add or two more nominees that you add at most, but it's always going to be the same set of people that you keep adding and subtracting from in your different places. Now, the reason why I think this is very interesting is because there is a program called Udgam by RBI. And what Udgam does is all the unclaimed assets that are lying there dormant in banks' accounts, Udgam has kind of gotten all of those together. And you can also see, where all are you a nominee that you've not claimed dibs on. And you can also see all your accounts where you don't have a nominee. So in the unfortunate event that you pass away, those accounts are going to end up being unclaimed. So I think when it comes to the entire concept of estate planning and nominee verification, giving an agency the right to write into our financial data by updating these nominee details, it's just going to be a one-click consent and it gets updated in all the different entities where we have some financial asset holding. So these were like the two use cases I could think of on the entire financial inclusion piece over there. Another interesting place that I thought we could possibly have is when CBDCs become mainstream and we've been exhibiting, let's say, good financial behavior. Then that is also something that the central banks need to know, or whoever's issued our CBDC wallet needs to be able to know that. And in case they want to actually reward good behavior, then that ability should also be there. Now, having said that, I can also understand why people would be skeptical of that, because if I can write into your account, then I may very well be able to delete from your account as well. So that is maybe something that we may not want to do. But when it comes to direct benefit transfers, uh, I think a right factor over there makes a lot of sense, especially for public distribution networks. Say that they've issued a CBDC worth 10,000 rupees into somebody's account, and the public distribution network then wants to be able to send back information to the finance ministry on what all is it that 10,000 has actually been used against. This, of course, will probably be something that is at least 10 years away from us, because we're still at open finance. We've not yet reached the entire overview of getting into open data over there. But yes, when that happens, I think we're going to be opening up endless possibilities for making sure people are financially included in the ecosystem. That's about all that I had from my end. If there's any question, then please do feel free. I know that it was a lot to take in. So yeah, if there are any questions. Yes, Dhaval. How are you doing, Dhaval? Very good to see you again over here.
Hello.
Hi, Dhaval. How are you doing?
Hello.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
My question is how this aggregator using personal data for uh, commercial purpose.
So you're talking about.
And basically for trade, basically.
So you're kind of breaking up for me over there, Dhaval. Could you come again, please?
How they monetize this data.
So you're asking whether account aggregators can use this personal
Because
data.
the aggregator using personal data for commercial purpose.
Okay. So account aggregator in India are end-to-end encrypted. So the account aggregator just acts as a data pipeline alone. It cannot take that data because it's encrypted end-to-end. The pipeline from where it starts to where it ends, it's completely encrypted. The data that passes through the account aggregators are blind to the entire data that goes through there. And by law, when you get an account aggregator license, you are not allowed to look at that data or even reuse that data that's out there. So, for commercial purposes, the data that passes through account aggregator can only be delivered to the entity, the financial information user, to whom the consumer has actually consented to share that data with, not with anyone else, not even with the account aggregator. So that can raise the question that how do account aggregators then make money over there? Well, the way that account aggregators currently make money today in India is on a SaaS basis. So per API call that's made or the per data delivery that happens, however they've kind of agreed upon, you're charged a particular percentage. So that's kind of how account aggregators make money today. Commercially, you're not allowed to make any use of that data that you're transmitting over there. However, and now that I'm just thinking this out loud, there's a lot of metadata that is passed on the pipeline. Not the data, the financial data part alone is encrypted, but the metadata that goes up, that a lot of it currently is not being, um, it's not encrypted. So is it possible today that I am trying to build a data model as an account aggregator on top of that? And is there a law that stops me from doing it? No, that's again residing in a gray area. So basically, to just give a little more context to what I'm saying, let's say that my mobile number has gone into an account aggregator against the purpose code of me getting a loan. So basically, I'm doing a loan inquiry over there for whatever XYZ bank that's there. So this metadata is there with the account aggregator. Can they then use this to build an alternative financial model for me? Maybe yes. Maybe they're able to see that Kamalika also has, she also has a demat account. She's also invested in the money markets because she's also pulling data from the money market demat account over there. While they cannot see how much of an asset I have, but they do know that I'm actively trading over there because that's why I'm pulling data every day. She also is probably someone who's very financially savvy because she's using a personal financial management app as well, and so on and so forth. So they can build, a metadata about me, about what all activities I am doing, and build some layer of user behavior on top of that. Is that being done currently? I do not think so. But can account aggregators do that? Definitely yes. There isn't any law that stops metadata from being used. Very interesting question, Dhaval. Thank you so much for
Okay.
that.
Okay.
Any other questions? Yes, Abbas. How are you doing, Abbas?
Actually, well, thank you very much for the session, Kamalika. Quick question from your perspective, like we've identified, various use topics through various use cases for open finance, open banking, etc. From your perspective, what are the main risks from a consumer perspective? If you could, share your thoughts on that, would be really useful.
Uh-huh. So today, if I see how open finance is in India, while we are giving a sense of what the user is consenting to, and by the way, the consent artifact on the open aggregator system, it's a very I mean, I want to say it's easy to understand, but I'll admit it. It's not that easy to understand over there. So it's quite possible that the user does not know what she's consenting to, what he or she is consenting to over there. In which case, it's quite easy that I make the consent artifact just look that much more complicated, and get away with, you know, misusing that data over there. By misusing, I don't really mean that the way that it's sold on the darknet misuse, but let's say that I say that I am taking your consent to help you with your personal finances, but ultimately, because I'm a bank, I also have like a credit card department, and then I start cross selling credit cards to you. Is that allowed? No, because you took my financial information to help me manage my personal finances, not to cross sell another data product to me. So on that note, I think I would want to spend half a second on the entire um, the consent artifact and the consent that you are agreeing to. There's a bunch of information that we kind of uh, share. We kind of agree to share. The first is the start and the end period of the consent. So every consent has a particular lifetime that's there. Now this consent could be like, let's say you are applying for a loan, then technically the consent should not live for more than when the loan application process is done, right? So in that case, maybe your expiry could be whatever time. Let's say it takes 5 days to underwrite a customer, then that 5 days is your consent expiry. Then you also have something called a consent mode, which is basically it tells you whether you this consent, whether the financial information user has to store it, or are they streaming it, in which case the minute they finish using the data, it has to be destructed at their end and stuff like that. Then you also have something called a fetch type. Now the fetch type basically tells you if this data is going to be pulled one time or recurrent pulls. You I don't think consent. So consent. Then you also have something called a consent type, which is basically if I'm getting the entire transactional history or just some parts of the profile data alone. The kind of financial data that you're planning to share with the end user, uh, the purpose against which you're sharing it. So remember, we were talking about various purposes like personal finance management, loan monitoring, loan underwriting, stuff like that, and the date range for which you want this financial information as well. This is a bunch of different types of information types that's there over there. Not everyone understands this. Like within the different financial types itself that's there, I may pretend to be asking about just your current account, but then as and when, say, even savings account is already live, but let's say joint account tomorrow becomes live, or Hindu undivided family accounts become live, I may also pull those information out without even you realizing what were the financial types you agreed to over there. So I think this is one of the biggest areas of misuse, where it's not very intuitive to understand these jargon that's there. So financial literacy has a long way to go before I feel consumers are going to understand and take in what is it that they're consenting to, and raise any doubts or any grievances if they see people not adhering to those particular consent artifacts that they had signed up for. Very long winding answer, Abbas. Did that make sense to you?
So thank you, thanks for that. That was really useful.
Any more questions? All right. Then with that, I'm ready to call it a night. I had a lot of, I mean, coming into this session, trust me, I was actually suffering from a very bad cold. But yes, just talking about this entire thing has kind of energized me so much. So I'm very glad that I got to do this with all of you. I'm so glad that all of you could join me as well. But with that, I'm ready to call it a night. And I will see you again next week, where we'll have another interesting topic to talk about. And that's mostly going to be about how payment aggregators in India has been evolving. So I'll see all of you again next time. Thank you so much for joining me this week. Bye, everyone.